The art in espionage is the ability to hide in plain sight, and the greatest of spies are the ones you never learn about. This statement rings true in the case of Anthony Blunt. His life seemed predestined for greatness. A Cambridge graduate with familial ties to the royal family, he was the very picture of establishment respectability. His brilliance as a polymath, fluency in multiple languages, and renown as a world-class art historian made him virtually untouchable, and he knew it. Beneath his veneer of aristocratic refinement lurked a secret that would shake Britain to its very foundations. For decades, Blunt operated as a Soviet spy as a member of the so-called Cambridge Five. His position in MI5 and then within the court of the British royal family granted him unprecedented access to top-secret information at the most critical junctures of World War II. It took 34 years before Blunt's treachery was finally revealed by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. As shocking as his betrayal was to the British public, a new hypothesis suggests that he may have also been handing secrets to the Nazis, which prolonged the war and cost thousands of Allied lives. Labeling Anthony Blunt as the most dangerous spy in history, as some have done, may seem hyperbolic, but when considering the information he had access to, and thus the power he held to influence the strategic balance of power, it may be true. Anthony Blunt was born on the 26th of September 1907 in Bournemouth, Hampshire, to a family with a strong Church of England background. His father, Arthur Stanley Vaughan Blunt, was a vicar and became the chaplain at the British Embassy in Paris. This led in 1911 to the family moving to France, where Anthony spent much of his childhood and where he attended preparatory school. It was also in France where Anthony's lifelong interest in French art and architecture was sparked. Anthony's mother, Hilda, was a distant relative of the British royal family, making Anthony the third cousin of the Queen Mother. The Blunt family was thus well entrenched in the ranks of the British establishment, a fact that would open many professional and social doors for young Anthony in his future. When he returned to England as a teenager, Blunt was educated at the prestigious Marlborough College from 1921 to 1926. There he joined the Society of Amici, a group of left-leaning intellectuals, and in 1928 he founded Venture, a magazine featuring left-wing writers. By this stage of his life, Blunt was already a staunch supporter of international communism. He later attended Trinity College in Cambridge, initially studying mathematics before switching to modern languages, graduating with a first-class degree in 1930. While at university, Anthony Blunt became involved with a secret society of intellectuals calling themselves the Apostles. Cambridge University as an institution emerged as a hotbed of communist and Marxist thought and activity during the 1930s. As such, the university was a fertile recruiting ground for the NKVD, the Soviet intelligence agency and precursor to the KGB. The environment of the 1930s, with its polarized political climate, made left-wing ideologies appealing to many disillusioned and disaffected young men. The Great Depression, the rise of fascism in continental Europe as seen in the Spanish Civil War and in Nazi Germany, and the perceived failures of Western capitalist democracies pushed many to view communism as the antidote to all the world's problems. In the words of Ernest Volkmann, post-war Great Britain was a time of shattered illusions and bleak futures in which Marxist ideology was nurtured and flourished. It had also become fashionable for the young intelligentsia, many of whom found themselves among the upper echelons of the British class system, to engage in an ideological rebellion. Anthony Blunt was also a homosexual, at a time when in Great Britain it was illegal to be so. This put him at personal odds with the state and society, perhaps emboldening him to embrace an ideology that was also in conflict with the establishment. His visit to Soviet Russia during this time also served to draw him ever further towards the political left. Through the apostles, Blunt met like-minded individuals, including Guy Burgess. Also a homosexual, Burgess was charming, witty, and prone to outbursts of outrageous behavior. This was in contrast to Blunt, who was reserved and austere. Blunt's involvement with the apostles and his Marxist beliefs put him firmly within the crosshairs of NKVD talent spotters on the campus. Former Roman Catholic priest and Soviet intelligence officer Theodore Marley initiated contact with Blunt and ultimately recruited him to work for the NKVD. This occurred either in 1933 or 1934. Blunt's primary work for the NKVD was to act as a talent spotter, identifying and assessing potential recruits among left-wing students at Cambridge. He went on to recruit others into the spy ring, which became known as the Cambridge Five. Its other members comprised Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, and John Cairncross. There was at least one other whom he recruited, fellow apostle and American Michael Straight, the significance of which would only be realized many decades later. While Anthony Blunt became known as the fourth man, given the exposure of other members of the Cambridge spy ring that preceded him, it is now believed that Blunt was in fact the first man recruited by the Soviets into the group which they called the Magnificent Five. There is, however, debate about whether it was Blunt who recruited Burgess or vice versa, with Blunt saying it was the charismatic and whimsical Burgess who recruited Blunt to the Soviet cause. There have been accusations of Blunt using his sexuality as a weapon in his Soviet recruitment strategy, romancing potential recruits and then threatening their exposure should they not toe the line. Whatever the truth, it is not disputed that Blunt enjoyed great success prowling the halls of Cambridge looking for new recruits. Having become a sleeper agent in the pre-war years, Anthony Blunt's career as an art historian was distinguished and influential. He was elected as a Fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, based on his dissertation on artistic theory in France and Italy during the Renaissance. His expertise in 17th century painting, particularly the works of Nicolas Poussin, would become widely recognized. It was, however, the outbreak of World War II in 1939 that saw Anthony Blunt and his fellow spies being activated for the Soviet cause. Blunt made a conscious decision not to join the Communist Party of Great Britain, but his communist affiliations became a blocker when he first applied to join the British Army Intelligence Corps. They do say, however, that it is who you know that counts. Also a member of the Cambridge Apostles Network was Baron Victor Rothschild of the famed banking family. At the time, he was working for MI5 as the head of the explosives and sabotage section. Rothschild put in a good word for Anthony, as a result of which he was promptly appointed to No. 21 Field Security Unit as a military liaison officer. Thus, despite being known as a communist sympathizer, it seems Blunt's strong anti-fascist stance led MI5 to consider him an asset rather than a threat. By December 1939, Blunt had attained the rank of captain and was stationed in Boulogne, France, as part of the British Expeditionary Force. He found his role to be distinctly dreary, and he wondered whether he was being punished for his past political affiliations. His military service was, however, short-lived, as he was among those evacuated during Operation Dynamo. Back in England, Anthony Blunt felt a renewed sense of commitment to anti-fascism. He desired to make a more meaningful contribution to the war effort, and felt that his talent for languages and his academic background made intelligence work the right fit for his ambitions. His decision to pursue a career in intelligence also cannot be seen as being entirely independent of Soviet influence. When the war broke out, Britain's Secret Intelligence Service needed all hands on deck. There was very little in the way of vetting processes, and provided one had gone to the right school, had good family connections, and was generally considered a good egg, you were in. The recruits were largely drawn from aristocratic backgrounds or those with familial ties to existing MI5 officers, many of whom, according to MI5 Secretary Joan Miller, were young men who had never worked before. As a result of the rapid expansion of British intelligence, in 1940, MI5 headquarters was secretly relocated to an evacuated section of Wormwood Scrubs Prison in West London. The prison's secondary role as intelligence HQ was short-lived. During the London Blitz of 1940, the Luftwaffe bombed the prison, requiring MI5 to relocate to other premises. It seemed strange for the Germans to specifically target a prison in a dive bomb attack, leading to questions over whether Nazi high command had received a tip-off. Blunt, of course, would have been a prime suspect. As a freshly recruited intelligence officer, Blunt was disappointed to be posted to D Division, which dealt with military security, and not counter-espionage and sabotage operations, which was where he desired to work. Nevertheless, it wasn't long before Anthony Blunt was transferred to B Division, responsible for counter-espionage against the Germans and the Soviets. There he soon made an impression on MI5 counterintelligence chief Guy Liddell. Blunt was 32 years old at that point, and became Liddell's personal assistant. Rumours abound that the two men were closer than mere colleagues. By this stage, the pre-war investment by the Soviets into recruiting their Magnificent Five started to pay dividends. Blunt was then working for MI5, Guy Burgess and Philby were climbing the ranks of MI6, and Donald Maclean worked in the British Foreign Office. By 1943, and completing the Cambridge Five, John Cairncross was working at Bletchley Park on ultra ciphers. In 1942, Anthony Blunt was tasked with heading up a project code-named XXX. This was an ongoing operation by the British to monitor the diplomatic missions of neutral countries, including Portugal, Spain, and Sweden. These nations being suspected of providing cover for German intelligence operations, Blunt's primary task was to develop methods of intercepting diplomatic bags from the embassies as they were transported back to their home countries. This allowed MI5 to examine and photograph their contents. Blunt's team collaborated with port security and the post office. At ports, couriers were persuaded to hand over their bags, which were then placed in a safe. Blunt's operatives would open the safe, remove the bags and examine them before resealing them without leaving any trace. Similar tactics were employed at airports, where flights were delayed to facilitate the interception of diplomatic pouches. As diplomatic bags and pouches were meant to be inviolable and not subject to search or seizure, the operation was highly illegal. MI5 was delighted at Blunt's ability to build a network of embassy workers to do his bidding, and even more so at the haul of confidential information it produced, as was the NKVD, for they too received photographed copies of all the information courtesy of Blunt. Blunt was also responsible for monitoring the movements of diplomatic staff and foreign nationals, information which he of course not only handed over to MI5, but the KGB also. As the war was heading towards its climax in 1944, Blunt was named MI5 liaison with the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the Allied High Command in Europe. This position not only gave him access to the intelligence emanating from Ultra, Britain's top-secret code-breaking operation, but also to key operational plans, including the invasion of Normandy. Blunt was assigned to a planning group responsible for putting the finishing touches on Operation Fortitude, the Allies' grand plan to deceive Hitler into believing that the invasion would happen at Calais, not Normandy. As a matter of course, Blunt passed on everything he knew about Fortitude, as well as all ultra-intelligence that came into his possession. This was derived mostly from intercepted and decrypted Wehrmacht radio traffic emanating from the Eastern Front. This was information that was invaluable to the Soviets. From the contents of diplomatic telephone conversations, deciphered diplomatic telegrams, to agency gossip and intelligence from embassies across Europe, Blunt supplied Soviet intelligence with no less than 1,771 documents between 1941 and 1945. One of Blunt's key contacts and suppliers of top-secret materials was stationed at Bletchley Park. Fellow spy ring member John Cairncross helped to pass on secret information regarding British code-breaking intelligence against the Germans to the Soviets. This breach was particularly significant given the sensitive nature of the work conducted at Bletchley Park. One may think that passing on intelligence to the Soviet Union, which was after all then an ally, was not so egregious an offence. However, even then, It was an uncomfortable truth that the marriage was one of convenience born out of a need to defeat a common enemy. Ultra-intelligence, Operation Fortitude, and the planned Normandy landings were top secret and highly compartmentalized. Much of the intelligence and planning was withheld from the Soviets for multiple good reasons. Blunt had a desire to see a communist revolution in his own country and would have had few qualms about Great Britain being defeated in war if it served as the birth pangs of a new communist utopia. Anthony Blunt's involvement with Soviet espionage is well established, but new research suggests that he may have also been involved in one of the most damaging espionage operations of World War II, the betrayal of Operation Market Garden. This ambitious Allied offensive, launched in September of 1944, with 40,000 paratroopers being dropped behind enemy lines, is today still regarded as one of the greatest airborne invasions in military history. It had as its aim to capture key bridges in the Netherlands, including that at Arnhem, and to pave the way for a rapid advance into Nazi Germany. However, the operation was a disaster, with more than 17,000 Allied troops lost in what became one of the final defeats of the war for the Allies. As well as bringing an abrupt halt to the Allied advance, the failure of Operation Market Garden also paved the way for Stalin's troops to first reach Berlin. Had this not happened, the Iron Curtain, which split Europe in two, may have only been a theory of alternate history enthusiasts, rather than a grim reality that shaped global geopolitics for decades. The hypothesis by author Robert Verkake links Blunt to a mysterious figure known as Agent Josephine, a Nazi spy who passed critical intelligence about Operation Market Garden to the Germans. Josephine's warnings allowed the German forces to anticipate the Allied attacks and prepare an effective defense. The identity of Josephine has long been a subject of speculation, but these recent findings suggest that Blunt may have been the spy. In mid-1943, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park first started intercepting communications signed off by the mysterious Agent Josephine. The decoded communications were described by one MI5 officer as being the best illicit intelligence derived by the enemy from this country which he had ever seen. British intelligence soon identified Josephine's handler, a German lawyer by the name of Karl-Heinz Kramer, who operated out of the German embassy in Stockholm. And guess who was put in charge of investigating and identifying the mysterious mole on behalf of MI5? None other than Anthony Blunt himself. As Blunt made initial inquiries and possibly ran interference in Britain, MI6 had a man in Stockholm, Peter Falk, who was doing his own investigating. Falk managed to recruit the housekeeper for the Kramers, who had taken a strong dislike to Mrs. Kramer. Using a pat of cold butter to create an impression of the key to Karl Kramer's safe, MI6 were able to create a duplicate. Copies of documents found in the safe revealed extraordinarily sensitive information relating to the Allied war effort. Information that could only have been obtained from somebody high up in the intelligence ranks in Britain. Peter Falk immediately returned to England with copies of the documents. On the 23rd of December 1943, he met with Anthony Blunt at the Reform Club to discuss his findings. After saying that he was greatly concerned about British and America's plans for post-war Europe falling into Soviet hands via Kramer, Blunt is said to uncharacteristically have lost his temper, first suggesting that the documents were fake, and then saying categorically that there was no possibility that information was being leaked to the Soviets. Blunt left the club that night with the documents in hand, having promised to investigate further and report to his superiors at MI5. There is no evidence that he ever did so. When Blunt did finally identify a possible suspect, he singled out a loose-lipped Swedish diplomat named Frank Serval as the mole. However, even after Serval's arrest, intelligence continued to flow to the Nazis, raising suspicions that Blunt had protected the real source, himself. The possibility that Anthony Blunt was also working as a spy for Nazi Germany presents a new radical reinterpretation of his legacy. Robert Verkake believes that it was Blunt himself who was Josephine, and that his role in sabotaging Market Garden aligned with both Nazi and Soviet interests. The theory suggests that by helping to thwart the Allied advance into Germany, Blunt may have been furthering the Soviet goal of controlling Eastern Europe. Had Operation Market Garden succeeded, Allied forces in all likelihood would have reached Berlin before the Soviets, altering the post-war balance of power. By ensuring the failure of the operation, Blunt may have been advancing Stalin's territorial ambitions. The argument goes that the reason that Blunt did not also compromise the Normandy invasion was because the opening of a second front in Europe also served Soviet interests. While it is an interesting theory, British intelligence agencies remained divided over the existence of Josephine, with some dismissing her, or him, as a mere fabrication or codename for various covert agents of the time. The notion that Anthony Blunt may have been both a Soviet and a Nazi spy would mark him as one of the most treacherous figures in modern history. His actions, if ever proven, directly contributed to the deaths of thousands of Allied soldiers and prolonged the war. By serving both Soviet and Nazi interests, Blunt's espionage had far-reaching consequences that shaped the course of World War II and the Cold War that followed. The mystery of Agent Josephine adds a new and darker dimension to Blunt's legacy. However, Miranda Carter, the author of His Lives, Anthony Blunt's seminal biography, remains highly skeptical that Blunt could have been Agent Josephine, her reasoning being not least of which that Blunt was so steadfastly anti-fascist that the possibility of him spying in any way to benefit the Nazis is beyond the realms of possibility. After the war, Anthony Blunt officially left the world of intelligence to return to a life of academia. In 1945, he was appointed Surveyor of the King's Pictures by King George VI. This was a role he continued under Queen Elizabeth II. This prestigious position brought him into close contact with the royal family and gave him access to royal residences and their art collections. His proximity to the monarchy and his reputation as an art expert provided him with an aura of respectability that helped deflect suspicion. Blunt was also appointed the director of the Courtauld Institute of Art in 1947, helping to transform it into a world-renowned institution. He was also a professor of art history at the University of London, and he was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy, even serving as its vice president. In August of 1945, King George VI personally tasked Blunt with a secret mission of utmost importance, at least to the Windsor family. Blunt was to accompany Sir Owen Morshead, the royal librarian, on a trip to Friedrichshof Castle near Frankfurt, Germany. The ostensible purpose of this mission was to retrieve voluminous correspondence written by Queen Victoria to her daughter, Empress Victoria, the mother of Kaiser Wilhelm II. There was, however, a more sensitive aspect to this assignment that required discretion. The true purpose of Blunt's mission was to recover damaging correspondence that would have shown certain members of the British royal family as being even more than just sympathetic to the Nazi cause. The Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, who had abdicated the throne in order to marry divorcee Wallis Simpson, was a fervent Nazi. His commitment to Nazi fascism was such that during a 1937 visit to Germany, Adolf Hitler had agreed a deal to install the Duke as the head of a puppet government once Germany had conquered England. The potential fallout, should those letters have come to light, was deemed so critical that Blunt and Morshead's secret mission was personally sanctioned not only by the King, but also by British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill. The two men successfully recovered the letters, but it is believed that Blunt secretly photographed the documents and passed them on to his Soviet handler, Yuri Modin. This mission, whether viewed through the lens of preserving royal history or concealing potentially damaging information, demonstrates the trust placed in Blunt by the royal family and the British establishment. Even though Blunt's direct espionage activities diminished as the war in Europe drew to its end, he maintained contact with Soviet agents. He continued to pass along gossip from his former MI5 colleagues, in particular his old boss Guy Liddell, and handed over photographs he had taken with his Leica camera of documents obtained from Guy Burgess. This ongoing connection ensured a steady flow of information to Soviet intelligence, even as Blunt's official role changed. He continued in this fashion until Burgess's defection to the Soviet Union in 1951, at which point he severed ties with the Soviets. Controversially, Blunt was involved in assisting in the defection of Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean to the Soviet Union. Prior to the arrival of MI5 officers, Blunt managed to sneak into Burgess's apartment to remove several incriminating pieces of evidence, including documents that would have linked him to the spy ring. This not only protected himself and his fellow spies, but also preserved the broader Soviet intelligence network within British institutions. Even with the incriminating evidence having been destroyed, suspicion still fell on Anthony Blunt in the wake of the defections, given that he was known to be a friend and associate of Maclean and Burgess. As suspicions increased, Blunt's KGB handler at the time, Yuri Modin, offered to make arrangements for Blunt to be extracted to the Soviet Union. Blunt, however, declined, having become disillusioned with the practical outworkings of communism as seen in the USSR, and chose rather to take his chances remaining in the United Kingdom. He faced interrogators 11 times over the next few years, but managed always to avoid formal charges due to a lack of evidence. In spite of all this, in 1956, Blunt's apparent exemplary service to the Crown was rewarded with a knighthood. While there were still those who quietly suspected that Sir Anthony had been up to no good with the Soviets during the war, his status as a respected art historian and royal servant made him appear above reproach. Cracks in this facade would, however, soon start to show as events beyond his control across the Atlantic began to unfold. The exposure of Anthony Blunt's espionage activities came about through a combination of long-standing suspicions and a crucial tip-off from an unexpected source. The pivotal moment came in 1964, when Michael Straight, the fellow Cambridge student whom Blunt had recruited years earlier, broke cover. Straight had applied for a position in the Kennedy administration and was being vetted. Concerned that his secret past would be uncovered, he chose to reveal his past association with Soviet intelligence. Michael Straight named Anthony Blunt as the person who had recruited him as a Soviet spy, saying that he, Straight, had undertaken some minor espionage work before having a change of heart and cutting off ties with his communist connections. This bombshell was promptly shared with British intelligence, setting in motion the events that would lead to Blunt's exposure. On the 23rd of April 1964, MI5 officer Arthur Martin visited Blunt's apartment near Oxford Street in London. Martin informed Blunt that they now had concrete proof that he was the fourth man in the Cambridge spy ring. Initially, Blunt denied the accusations, maintaining the facade he had upheld for decades. The turning point came when Martin offered Blunt immunity from prosecution in exchange for a full confession. Weighing his options, and faced with this proposition, Blunt finally admitted to his espionage activities with the simple statement, "It's true." During his debriefing, he revealed only that which he was certain MI5 already knew. There was no doubt to all involved that Blunt was withholding information. For instance, he failed to identify John Cancross as the fifth man in the ring, which was only confirmed following the defection of Oleg Gordievsky in 1985. Blunt withheld that information, and who knows what else. The confession ought to have marked the end of Blunt's double life as a respected art historian and secret Soviet agent, but his position and status continued to protect him. The British authorities made the controversial decision to keep Blunt's confession a secret. This decision was likely influenced by a desire to avoid public embarrassment and to protect the reputation of both British intelligence and the Crown. Whether or not the information Blunt had retrieved from Germany years earlier had anything to do with it remains an open question. Blunt was allowed to retain his knighthood and continue his work, including maintaining access to the royal family. This was even after Queen Elizabeth II had been informed of his treachery. It wasn't until 1979, 15 years after his confession, that Blunt's espionage activities were finally made public. It was that year that certain MI5 officers, outraged by the cover-up, leaked details of the deal with Blunt to author Anthony Boyle. His book, The Fourth Man, or The Climate of Treason, made the case for a fourth Soviet spy among the Cambridge spy ring. While Boyle did not expressly name Blunt, Maurice, the pseudonym given to the character in the book, could have been none other than Anthony Blunt. When published, the book set off a media frenzy. With Blunt having failed to stop its publication through his lawyers, the magazine Private Eye first publicly connected Blunt to the story. Thus, on the 15th of November 1979, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, responding to a question in the House of Commons, finally revealed that Sir Anthony Blunt had been a Soviet spy. The Prime Minister's decision to reveal the truth, beyond the pressure brought on by the book by Boyle, was driven by a complex interplay of personal conviction and political strategy. Thatcher was apparently personally affronted by the immunity deal granted to Blunt, and viewed the entire episode as reeking of establishment collusion. Thatcher's choice resonated with many in MI5 who had long resented the protection afforded to a known traitor, and sparked a broader debate about the handling of the Cambridge spy ring and the extent of Soviet penetration into the British establishment. Anthony Blunt's fall from grace was swift. Within hours of Thatcher's announcement, he was stripped of his knighthood. The loss of his title was just the beginning of his public disgrace. Professionally, Blunt's standing in the academic and art world crumbled. He was removed from his fellowship at Trinity College, severing his long-standing ties with the institution where his academic career had flourished and his spying career had germinated. The British Academy, of which Blunt was a fellow, faced pressure to expel him. Rather than face the humiliation of expulsion, Blunt opted to resign. He also resigned immediately from his most prestigious position, that of Surveyor of the Queen's Pictures, a role he had held since 1945. This severance from the royal household was particularly significant, given his long-standing connection to the monarchy and the trust that had been placed in him despite knowledge of his espionage. Blunt's reputation as an art historian, which he had built over decades, was irreparably damaged. His scholarly work, once highly respected, became tainted by his treachery. The public exposure led to intense media scrutiny and public condemnation. Blunt, who had enjoyed a privileged position in British society, became a pariah overnight. He was forced into seclusion, hiding from the press and the public outrage. Anthony Blunt made a single rare public appearance in a televised interview on the 20th of November 1979. This interview, broadcast on RTN's News at 10, saw Blunt explain his decision to spy for Soviet Russia. He framed his actions as putting conscience before country in the cause of anti-fascism, and that he remained loyal to the crown. He categorically denied that his actions during World War II had put any lives at risk, stating that the information he passed to the Soviets was almost exclusively about German intelligence services, and that he had no access to information about British agents or military defences. He also addressed his continued work with the royal family after his confession in 1964, describing his ability to compartmentalise his roles as schizophrenic. When pressed about being labelled a traitor, Blunt acknowledged that he had been referred to as such, but maintained that he hadn't betrayed his conscience. Anthony Blunt then finally retreated from public life. His memoirs, written after his unmasking but only published posthumously in 2009, revealed the psychological toll of his double life and the impact of its public revelation. Blunt chose to shed no further light on the extent of his betrayal. His writings did little to rehabilitate his reputation, with his contriteness being ascribed to regret at having lost his social position and status, rather than stemming from genuine remorse. To this day, Anthony Blunt remains a subject of enduring fascination and debate. In popular culture, Blunt's dual life has been featured in numerous books, documentaries, and dramatizations, including Netflix's The Crown. Anthony Blunt's contributions to Soviet intelligence were substantial and multifaceted, from passing on ultra secrets during World War II and possibly also compromising Operation Market Garden, to facilitating the escape of his fellow spies in the 1950s. His actions provided the Soviet Union with a wealth of sensitive information and significantly compromised British national security. Anthony Blunt died of a heart attack in 1983 at the age of 75 in his Bayswater flat in London. Shorn of his titles and status, he remained totally unrepentant. If it is true that in addition to the Soviets, he also spied for the Nazis, then it is undeniable that Mr. Anthony Blunt is indeed one of the world's most monstrous spies. No matter the full truth, of which we will probably never learn, he is remembered as one of the most notorious and dangerous British spies of the 20th century.